In January 1996, Mary Lindgren was 67 years old, a mother of three and a grandmother living in an assisted living facility in Covina, California. A stroke 7 years earlier had left her weak, with limited mobility and almost no ability to defend herself. That's why she needed a first-floor room in the first place. That room had a sliding glass door that opened straight onto the parking lot. For most residents, it was a shortcut to fresh air. For a woman who couldn't run and couldn't fight, it was an unlocked entry point into a room where she slept alone. Sometime in the overnight hours of January 18th into the 19th, someone walked across that lot, opened that door, and got in. What happened to Mary Lindgren that night was extreme. A violent assault that left her with severe injuries, ending in her death. When staff found her unresponsive the next morning and detectives arrived, they told her son not to look at her face. That's how bad it was. Every lead, dead end. The investigation that followed did almost everything right. Detectives interviewed every staff member at the facility, every resident, every visitor, every delivery driver, every contractor who'd ever had a legitimate reason to be on the property. They canvassed the whole neighborhood. One by one, every single person was cleared. Meanwhile, crime lab technicians had pulled something crucial from the scene. Biological evidence carrying the attacker's DNA. They built a full genetic profile, essentially a fingerprint made of DNA, and ran it against California's state database and the FBI's national database. Nothing. No match, then or for years afterward. Here's the part that's genuinely unsettling. Nobody made a mistake. The evidence was solid, the police work was thorough, and none of it mattered, because the man who left that DNA behind had simply never been arrested for anything serious enough to land his DNA in a database. As far as the system was concerned, he didn't exist, and a search engine can't find a name that was never entered. So the case went cold, not from neglect, but because the one tool that could identify him hadn't been invented yet. The detective who wouldn't close the file. One of the original detectives on scene that morning in 1996 was a man named Joe Purcell. He retired from active duty in 2009 and immediately came back as a cold case investigator, bringing Mary Lindgren's file with him. It sat on his desk for over a decade while the rest of the world moved on. The evidence itself had been kept in climate-controlled storage that entire time, still usable, still waiting for a technology nobody had access to in 1996. That technology arrived in 2019, when Los Angeles investigators partnered with the DA's cold case unit to try something different. A standard database search only asks one question: is this exact person's DNA already on file? For over 20 years, the answer had always been no. So this time they asked a different question entirely. Not, is this him, but is anyone in the database related to him? It's called familial DNA searching, and California had built the first formal policy, allowing it back in 2008. In 2020, investigators finally ran Mary Lindgren's case through it. A name, finally. In July 2020, 24 years after the murder, the search came back with something detectives hadn't had in decades: a partial match. Not the killer himself, but someone closely related to him, sitting in the state database for an unrelated case. Tracing that family tree led investigators to an unprofiled relative living in El Monte, California, a man named David Bernal. A familial match isn't proof, though. It's a direction. To make it hold up in court, they needed Bernal's own DNA, collected in a way that wouldn't tip him off that he was the target of a 24-year-old murder investigation. So, they didn't knock on his door. They watched his trash Investigators quietly surveilled his house, waiting for the most mundane moment imaginable. Trash day. Once Bernal set his garbage cans out at the curb, it was legally abandoned property. No warrant required. Officers collected it, pulled a usable DNA sample from it, and sent it to the lab for comparison against the decades-old crime scene profile. It was a complete match. A detective working for free. Here's the detail that turns this from a forensic story into a human one. In mid-2020, right as this case was closing in on a suspect, Los Angeles County budget cuts eliminated nearly the entire cold case unit Purcell worked in. His paid position officially ended on July 1st, 2020. He kept working anyway, unpaid, off the clock. He kept coordinating the surveillance and the DNA verification through July and into August, seeing the case through to an arrest without a paycheck attached to any of it. It's the kind of detail that sounds made up. It isn't. It's documented in the news coverage that followed once the story broke nationally. On August 6, 2020, detectives arrested David Bernal at his home. That same morning, Don Lindgren was at his mother's grave when his phone rang. Who was on the other end? Bernal was 22 years old at the time of the murder, with no known connection to Mary Lindgren, her family, or the facility. Nothing in the record suggests this was personal. Investigators describe it as an opportunistic act against a woman who had almost no ability to fight back. He lived the next 24 years without ever crossing paths with the justice system in a way that would expose him, right up until a relative's routine DNA entry connected the dots. He was charged with first-degree murder, along with special circumstance allegations tied to the assault and the break-in, charges that put him in range of life without parole. He's pleaded not guilty, and as of the most recent public record, the case remains in pre-trial proceedings, meaning legally, guilt is still for a jury to decide. What actually solved this case wasn't one dramatic break. It was evidence preserved for 24 years in a freezer, a technology that didn't exist when the crime happened, a detective who refused to let a file go cold even after his own job disappeared, and, in the end, a trash can at the curb on an ordinary morning. If all of that was enough to crack a case this old, it's worth wondering how many other cold cases are sitting in evidence lockers right now, just waiting on the science to catch up.